be here with you tonight. Tonight we have a guest speaker, of course. Most of you, or at least some of you, probably know him. If you do, I apologize. But he's here to speak to us about the
establishment of the town of Lancaster.
Okay. The history of the establishment of the town of Lancaster. Of course, it helps that he was there, and so he'll be able to, he will be able to give some first-hand account of that. But he really is a local historian, and he wouldn't want to use the term expert or anything like that. But he does know a whole lot about the subject, and so he's going to inform us about that subject. And so we're happy to have him here and to speak to us tonight. This is Fred Simpson. And if you don't know him, you'll get a chance to talk to him afterward. But we thank him for being here tonight, and I'll let him go.
Okay, this is a larger crowd than we used to have. I've done this several times over the years. My mom was kind of president or secretary for the Historical Society for many years, and of course I got called on because she always knew where I was, and she could reach me. But like I say, I've only got about 6 or 7 handouts to pass out, and we evidently got quite a bit more people than that. Isaac is working on getting some copies, but how we can distribute these most fairly, I don't know. But,
Let's go
okay. Are anybody in groups where I could you could share one? Catherine, my daughter, she doesn't need one. She okay. Anybody else that would like to have one, and then we'll try to get some more later. They're working. Okay, anybody else? Oh, we got. I've got 2 more. If anybody would like to have one. Okay. And like I say, if you don't get one tonight and I'm interested, I'm sure we can get one for you. And I guess I'm over. Catherine says I need to be in the back of the podium because my mom cannot hardly get out anymore. And this was her life for 25 years. In fact, the talk tonight will be based on, this book that she's put together, which is basically, I did a lot of the writing, but she did all the hard work. I have a farm and I've done several other things. And I just kind of write the stories. She goes to the archive in Frankfurt, to the courthouses, researches, tries to find copies of old letters. And this is the story of the establishment of Lancaster that she's put together. And it's first-hand sources. It's deeds, letters, court records, and copies. More than anything else, it's copies of lawsuits that she found down in the archives in Frankfurt, which are full of depositions of the original settlers, and they actually talk about what they saw here in the 1780s. And this is very useful too, because she would go up there and copy the old record books, and this is the original court order book for the Garrard County Court. She made the copies very hard to read, so in my spare time I'd go in and just hand copy and decipher, because I could read this so much better than I could the old antique handwriting. But it's all in here, and we've tried to use first-hand information as much as we could. But, Miriam called me and asked, would you give a talk on the establishment of the town? And I said, well, where would it be? She said, well, the Historical Society. What an appropriate place to have it. We're convinced, that's my mom and I, we're kind of a little duo that we don't follow the crowd. We've tried to do original research, and we know this was Tom Buford's property. Thomas Buford, the son of the original owner of the town lot, of the 57 acres that were made into the town of Lancaster. Namesake of Captain Thomas Buford, who died at the Battle of Point Pleasant. He owned the lot. In 1821, he sold it. And a lot of people in the past have thought that he must have had a little old log cabin or some little shack almost on here, because he didn't sell it for very much money. But what had happened, and a lot of people don't know, is that in 1819, In the aftermath of the War of 1812, they had what they were called the Panic of 1819. And people were left holding notes and debts payable in gold and silver, and they had been accepting what they call Commonwealth paper, or paper money. And you could have been extremely wealthy in 1818, and by 1821, you were struggling. There was no possible way you could settle up even, because you were holding lots of, basically, it was this rapid inflation like we're seeing right now. The paper money was worth less and less, and gold was going up. Thomas Buford, there's a letter from John Bryan in 1821, about the time he sells his property, saying, even Thomas Buford's not worth hiding your hair curried up. He's gone broke. And but still, he was considered the first citizen of Lancaster. He was married in Dryden's Tavern out there behind the Christian Church, which was the first public building associated with what would become Lancaster. He was married there. His dad had 57 acres that were made into the town of Lancaster. He was postmaster here for years, and the people just loved him. And when he died in February, it's an odd fact, in February of 1861, 3 of the most loved people that had ever lived in Lancaster all died within about 3 days. Governor Robert Letcher, Abner Baker, who lived where Garrard, the chicken place, the Lee's Fried Chicken, is part of his home. They moved it. But he had lived there where Garrard Automotive is now. And he married a Letcher and a Buford. So that made him kinfolks to all the big wheels around town, and everybody knew and loved him. And Thomas Buford, the owner of this property. We think a substantial part of the house would have been Thomas Buford. So here we are in his home, talking about the events that he was a part of and witnessed in his life. And like I say, they almost shut the town down when he died. In his old age, he had to leave, and he was living with one of his daughters in Mount Sterling. But when they brought him back, and they had a big ceremony with a brass band by Buford's Tavern. Does everybody know where Buford's Tavern was? No. That was the old Thompson Mar Hardware. It was built by Thomas Buford ran it for a while. We think it was built by his dad, William. I go into it in these papers. I don't know. Lancaster was the biggest need for Lancaster was a place to house all the people that would, since it was made a county seat, house the people that came in court days. So they had to have taverns where you could get a meal and sleep. They had to have water for everybody rode a horseback or a wagon, and so Buford had to establish a town spring down there by right there. We had a marker put up there, basically down from the Baptist church, that intersection of East Maple and used to be North Campbell. I think it's called Martin Luther King or something now. But anyway, I will ramble. I've got away from what I wanted to, in my remarks here, I thought they were pretty good. Of course. I'm going to read this first paragraph. I said, the establishment of Lancaster, Kentucky, or the Song of Lancaster, with apologies to Eugenia Dunlap. I thought I might borrow the title of her epic poem. She wrote an epic poem around 1876 called The Song of Lancaster, modeled after the epic poems of Longfellow. And a lot of the things, that's 100 years after Lancaster was settled almost. But her dad, George Washington Dunlap, was a United States congressman. They lived where the old high school, now the Lancaster Grade School is. And he knew everybody, and she got a lot of her facts from him. Anyway, some 30-odd years ago, I began a search for the story of the place that has been my home for 70 years. I suppose I had hoped to find I can't read without my glasses. I'm going to get my glasses out. I am 70 years old. I had hoped to find some pure time when motives were less muddled and aspirations higher. Instead, I found a discordant tune not unlike my own time in many ways. Still, I see this story as a type of song with repeating verses and choruses over the years that points towards some higher truth. And that's what interests me in this whole, why we put so much time into it. When I was a kid, my playground, we built a little house down there, a little white house across from where my mom lives now on Danville Street, where York Street hits Danville Street. I'd go back, my grandfather Simpson, who was also Fred Simpson, my dad was Fred Simpson. I'm Fred Logan Simpson, so I'm not, I was in the paper Fred Simpson Jr. I'm not Fred, my dad was Fred Simpson Jr. I'm Fred Logan Simpson. And anyway, my great-grandfather Fred Simpson owned that property, and at the back of it was the remains of the old Yanis Tan Yard, which dates back to the very beginning of the town. And I can remember not even in school yet, loving to go back there and trying to imagine what all these old foundations and brick walls were. And it wasn't for many, many years later we found the deed. I've got the deeds in this book to Jacob Yanis, and he built one of the original tan yards. Okay, man, I hope I'm not, am I rambling too much? And let's see. The start of the town of Lancaster. The town of Lancaster could be said to begin on October the 10th, 1774, about 2 or 3 miles up from the Ohio River on the Kanawha River. All the militiamen from Western Virginia had been called out by the leader of the colony of Virginia. We were still part of an England then. We were just about ready to have a revolution, but not quite. The Shawnee and the Mingo tribes had been coming down into Kentucky and making it impossible to survey. And the word got out that they were going to launch a major war. So they had all the young men across Western Virginia assembled in various militia units. And they're there sitting around those campfires waiting for the battle. They're going to fight Cornstalk, the leader of the Shawnee, trying to keep them north of the Ohio River so that we could do surveys in this area. And Daniel Boone was given the mission to go to Kentucky and bring all the surveyors back. And he did that. And he met there where the army was gathered on the lower Kanawha. And he told all these young militiamen, most of them 17, 18, 19, 20 years old, about this unclaimed, beautiful, level land just open, ready for settlement. No one's living there. It's empty. It's great. You can make a fortune. And so as soon as this battle was pretty inconclusive. Cornstalk, the leader of the Shawnee, was a great military leader. And basically, Andrew Lewis, all he could do, even though he had these large number of militiamen, was a standoff. But it did provide about a 2-year period, 1775 and 1776, when these soldiers could come out and locate land in Kentucky. And many of them did. Kobe, one of our grandfathers, David Finley, was one of them. There's just many of them. All these people you're going to read about in the book making claims in Lancaster had served in one of these militia units. The streets in Lancaster would be named, the named streets that weren't named, that were named for people were Pauling, Campbell, and Buford. Captains a captain of a military unit that served at the Battle of Point Pleasant. I'll get lost, so I see too many people looking at me. I'll do the best I can. Well, they came out in groups to the 3 forts at Harrodsburg, Boonesboro, and Stanford. We're roughly midway between those 3. And these people these former militia members who had come out looking for land would assemble where they knew the most people, or, Harrodsburg was strongly associated with Harrod, was one of the captains, James Harrod, and he had the Cowanses and the Wilsonses had served under him at Point Pleasant, and by 1775, there they are at Harrodsburg. Now, Boonesboro sent the Kennedys, the Woolies, the Boyles. They came and made land claims up around Paint Lick and White Lick. Benjamin Logan came up Dix River from Stanford and went up what today is called Town Branch. Some of the maps call it White Oak Creek. Back then they called it Elkhorn Creek, but it's all the same thing. The name has just changed over the years. He made some early claims. Benjamin Logan did from Stanford. Most of the claims on Lancaster were these Cowans, Robert, Andrew, and maybe another one, and John and Robert Wilson coming from Harrodsburg, who you can just see them. They came on down like, to Dix River, and they went up Dix River to Boone's Creek, and they went up Boone's Creek. If you keep following Boone's Creek to its head, where do you end up, Kobe?
Down the Logan Power Station.
Right, exactly. That's one. There's 2 or 3 heads, but that's probably the big one. The other stream that actually ended in Lancaster, you came up Benjamin Logan, John Wilson made a claim is at the head of White Oak Creek. That's where Abner Baker would live. That was the Garrard Automotive. And there's that spring, I don't know if it still is, when I was a kid, you could move this piece of old metal roofing, and you could see the spring down there flowing, and a lot of people around town kept their minnow buckets in there, and that was the Baker Spring, which was that and the spring below the fire department were the 2 most important springs to the settlement of Lancaster. Okay, let me put my glasses back on, see if there's anything I'm leaving. Okay. I wanted to make this point. There were 2 revolutions occurring in the old Virginia colony at this time, and both would play an important role in the establishment of Lancaster. One was largely secular. It was just people wanting to make money, And this one would lead to war with England shortly. The other was a spiritual revolution, a part of the Second Great Awakening, which would lead to the traveling church. In fact, there were 2 traveling churches that came to Garrard County. One led by Lewis Craig, the other by Robert. Help me out. Well, when you get 70 years old, you have mental Elkin. Okay, Robert Elkin. Now, I always think to come up with the name, I have to think of the Boy Scout leader, Dan Elkin, because I admired him so when I was a kid, and he would let us camp on the old Elkin farm there, but anyway, he was a descendant of the Robert Elkin that led the second traveling church here. Well, most of these people that we've been talking about at the battle, they're part of that secular revolution, and they will move on. They leave very little family. Most of us that have deep ties in Garrard County descend from traveling church families because they bought land from these early explorers, and they lived there for generations. And that's why I'm here, I guess, and most of us that have been here a long time. Okay. Tonight I brought a binder. I was going to talk about how I've already mentioned that this is hand copied to the first 2 order books of the Garrard County Court, and these are, you're welcome to look at it. It's articles, surveys. There's 2 surveys. I'm getting a little, where am I looking to find here? Okay. How did Lancaster come to that? Okay. At where we've been talking about the spring where they kept the minutes. Okay. That was a John Wilson home. He sold it to William Dryden. William Dryden sold it to William Buford, the father of Thomas Buford, and the brother of Captain Thomas Buford, who was killed at Point Pleasant. And this Thomas Buford here's his namesake. That led to the first building that you could say you could call Lancaster was some kind of a settlement. In 1784, that would have been Dryden's Tavern. Okay, in 1782, a member of the Lincoln County Court came out and settled down below the fire station at what we call the public spring. That was James Speed, and we know that because a member of the party gave a deposition during a court case telling when he came out with James Speed. So much of this will be based on depositions of people that took part in this process and were called into court to tell what they remembered about it, because all the heirs of James Speed were suing Henry Pauling. Henry Pauling was also a captain at the Battle of Point Pleasant, Botetourt County. Many future Lancaster people were served under him. He made a claim based on Andrew Cowan's improvement at a spring there where the old, the J.L. Teeter place, William Kirby lived there. Down where their shop is, if you've ever been back behind the big house, that's, Pauling and James Speed were rivals on the Lincoln County Court. James Speed was an extremely intelligent man. I mean, you've heard of that Speed Mansion down in Louisville. We went there one time. That's the same family. And but he fell out with everybody. One time he quit the court and walked off and said, if they're not going to listen to me and agree with me, I just can't serve, But anyway, he was content. I'm not going to get into all the bad things. You talk about like I say, it's a checkered past. These people were human. They did good things, and I've always wanted to look for heroes. That's what got me interested. I grew up, I loved the Lone Ranger. That was my first hero, and I wanted to see. But then you get in there, and I'm not going to get into all the part, but there were a lot of reasons that they were big rivals. And Henry Pauling had the better claim. James Speed, even though he was very intelligent, he took a claim from Anthony Bledsoe that really should have been located up toward Drake's Creek. And he claimed that the oak tree marked AB was located out on what today is Danville Street, close to the Buford thing. And he actually settled down at the spring, the public spring below the fire department in October 9th, 10th, something like that. I think they actually give 3 days that it took them. They came first to Craig Station, and then they came down there and settled and built cabins. He made a claim that overlapped the Pauling claim. And Pauling's claim was better, even though he settled a man named Major Cobb, that we don't know his first name, that had been living at Downing Station. Again, Downing Station, you have to remember, prior to Lancaster, there was nothing really here. The closest things were Craig Station, where all the church people, the traveling church he came to, everybody knows where that's at. Really, it's midway between Crab Orchard Road and Fall Lick Road, just south of town. And the nearest fortage station where you had protection from the Indians was Downing Station. James and John Downing, again, had been captains of one of these militia units at the Battle of Point Pleasant. When they came out, they built a fortage station there where Forks of Dix River Church is, up on the hill there above the cemetery. And all the people from Craig Station was never forted. And when there was Indian danger, the people had a trace that they would get in, and they would walk across what's today South Campbell Street. Or really, it's more down toward the cemetery. It's not the exact path of South Campbell, but it parallels it. For roughly from the depot, the old depot building, down the back of Baston Lumber, Mill Street, Ball Alley. They hit Boone's Creek. Boone's Creek takes you on around to 27, and then roughly you follow the dividing ridge on to Downing Station. Okay, that trace and that road was crossed by traces from Boonesboro to Danville, here in what would become Lancaster, and that's how we were a crossroads. Anyway, Speed eventually leaves and goes elsewhere because it looks like Pauling is going to win the day with his claim. But his heirs continue to sue Pauling for years, right up through the 20s. And in 1811, we had to have a survey done by Samuel McKee. Of course, he was a United States congressman. He's one of the men that lived at the House of Congressmen, you know, here on Maple Avenue. He was a Kentucky I don't know if he was a Kentucky congressman or actually, I think he was U.S. congressman. He volunteered for the War of 1812 and marched north. There's an article from that time, written at the time, that talks about how the U.S. Anyway, that's Samuel McKee, very well-known guy. His family home was torn down to build, I guess today's the middle school, but when I went there, it was the Garrard County High School. That was the McKee home. Where were we at now? We're talking about, these lawsuits between the Speed heirs and Pauling called for surveys that to prove who was here when. And one was run in 1811 by Samuel McKee. Another one run in 1813 by Arabia Jackson Brown. Some of you all here today would be kin to him. I think I probably am distantly. Some of you were closer than I would be. And when he was county surveyor in 1813. And in these surveys, they're in here if you want. If anybody wants to find them, you know, here's the Jackson survey, and here's some in there, and we've got from all the law books. We've got all these. There were law books that were printed and bound back at that time that show all these too. But these came from papers that my mom found at the State Archives in Frankfurt, and that actually show where all original settlers. And here is I'm going to sum up what you can glean from these two surveys about the earliest settlers in Lancaster. Charles Campbell, again, the Campbell, I don't think he was a captain, but William Campbell was a captain, lived on Campbell Street, and he was distinguished as Captain William Campbell from William Campbell the shoemaker. So, you know, I can't be real specific about who this Charles Campbell is, but he settled there close to today's Garrard County High School in 1781. It's shown on the map. He had 1,400 acres surveyed in his name there. He's living there by 1781. Next to settle would be James Speed, October 20th, 1782, at what would become Wallace's Crossroads near the town spring. Third, I've got Henry Pauling. In 1781, he settled a man he knew, Captain Major Cobb. But of course, the people from Downing Station would run him off because he took up with Thomas Shelton's wife there, and they didn't like it. Back then, you didn't do that kind of thing. People would. The friends of Thomas Shelton made sure that Major Cobb no longer lived here. And anyway, that left Henry Pauling's claim empty there for a year or two. Henry Pauling, though, came out in 1784 and settled there. Okay. It shows the Dryden's Tavern site. That's the spring, Garrett Automotive. You know, now the old building, the Lee's Fried Chicken that was moved from there was part of the old avenue. That site is shown in these surveys as being William Buford's, Thomas Buford's, and Abner Baker's. Abner Baker, you know, was one of the three people that died in February of 1861 that the town just shut down to honor. They had a big procession from Buford's Tavern to the cemetery with a brass band, and just before the Civil War broke out, which was, you know, these people were so patriotic, and it would have broken their hearts to see the country fighting itself, and they all died just within weeks of when the Civil War broke out. Okay, that's all these people were, and Dryden's Tavern are associated with that site. Okay, fifth, John Jackman. He hired Benjamin Logan to locate him land here, and he settled twice. First he settled, you know where the African American cemetery is down on the road going? I think that's probably the original town cemetery. It's the original Jackman cemetery, and it just over the years kind of became the African American cemetery. And then he settled later down closer to the sewer plant. There's an old cave down there that was well known as Jackman's Cave. But anyway, he owned quite a bit of land. He would sell the land to young William Owsley that he built Pleasant Retreat on in 1807. John Jackman would, because he had well over 1,000 acres there. Okay, 6, it indicates the home of Elijah Gates. Okay, if you come down Hamilton Avenue and hit Buckeye Road, you see Boone's Creek going kind of northwest. If you go about 1/8 of a mile, there's a big rocked-in spring. That's Elijah Gates Spring where he settled. He was an early settler. That was considered almost Lancaster on the trace going from Craig Station to Downing Station. See, and when I was a kid, we lived on Dickerson Court for 1 year. That's where we'd go play. I played at all these places, you know, when I was a little kid. That's what made it so interesting. But I don't know why, even as a kid, I was drawn to these old places. And, okay, that's Elijah Gates. I don't know much to say about him. He doesn't play a big role. Elijah Sarton marries his daughter. And, of course, that's another big story. I'm not going to get into that, but it's a real good story. But anyway, Elijah, he's a penniless orphan, buys up a lot of tobacco and puts it on 3 flatboats down at the mouth of Sugar Creek. And they're all saying a big rain's coming. He said, well, if my tobacco is going to go to HEOL, I'm going to go with it. And he rides it out, and they don't see him for 3 years. And what he had done, he went down to New Orleans and sold enough of the tobacco to buy a ship, loaded the ship with the other 2/3, and went to England and became an instant millionaire and made a name for Garrard County tobacco, Old Sugar Creek Bright Tobacco in England. The Wall family that lived down at Scott's Fork came over from Great Britain as a representative of a tobacco company, and they wanted to come to Sugar Creek because of that trip. But anyway, that's a sideline. Okay, William Pauling settled on Herring Heights about 1788. He went insane. I won't say much more about it. But his widow, and he died, but his widow Susanna Pauling was mentioned a lot in the early town records, donated the land for the first church. You know, there wasn't a church in Lancaster until 1816. In fact, it never really got finished and was used very little. But she did donate land for a church in 1816. There, the Republican Church, it's kind of right between, kind of behind Baston Lumber toward the depot. It's where it was located. The railroad tracks came through and destroyed it when they came in with the railroad in 1868, and actually they tore up most of the oldest graves in town when they did that. A lot of people lamented that fact, but even then, if you talked about the past, people say, "Oh, you're a fuddy-duddy." We got to have progress. If it means a few graves getting moved, we'll do it. We'll get a railroad. But anyway, the railroad went over top of the Republican Church in the original graveyard. John Burdett, another kinfolk. He's a brother to Frederick Burdett. He lived at Cave Springs. Okay, Thomas Owsley, the grandfather of Governor William Owsley, lived on Conn's Lane. The Roy Arnold farm was part of the old Thomas Owsley farm. I keep looking at Cole because we're cousins, and he knows a lot of and Reuben Arnold. Boy, Kobe, I get to look at you again. Reuben Arnold, he was one of ours. He lived out there in the big house on the left. As you go out of town, how do I describe it? Everybody knows where it's at. The old Clark farm, who owned that before? The big old house that it's way older than Lancaster. The original road went along this side of it, connecting Stanford and who am I? Does nobody know where I'm talking about? The old Reuben Arnold house.
It's in behind East LA, ain't it? That
no, I'm talking about going out of town north on 27.
Oh.
You've got Boone, where Sugar Creek turns right.
Oh, that house that was tore down, wasn't it?
No, it's still
One
there.
at the corner of Sugar Creek.
My daughter Sarah took her first steps in that house on an old ash floor. Judy Clark lived. That's the reason we were there. Judy Clark was living there then.
Earl
Clark. some lady from Florida or somewhere lives down there, has horses and has big signs, pups for sale.
Oh, the brick house.
Yeah, it's a big brick house. That house is older than Lancaster. And Reuben Arnold moved there in 1788. He's a brother to our ancestor, John. And they were traveling church people. And, man, you know, I get so many things going through my head, I get lost. I'm doing the best I can here. Okay. Reuben Arnold. Okay, other people that settled around that are shown by these maps. Is somebody got a question? Or George Douglas, who lived by Spurling's funeral home, he had a big spring called Douglas's Spring, and the first session of Garrard County Court was held in his home there, because there wasn't a Lancaster yet in June 5th. See, Garrard County was proposed in 1796, but up until through May of 1797, you still went to Richmond or Harrodsburg or Stanford to do your business because there was no functioning court. But as it began officially on June the 5th, 1797, in the home of George Douglas out there where Spurling's funeral home is, and they got to plan Lancaster, see. And that's what they do over the next 2 or 3 meetings. Okay, another one is William Bryant, who lived somewhere. Somebody tell me time-wise. I don't even have a clock or anything. How are we doing?
You're doing good.
I got time. William Bryant lived somewhere in the parking lot behind the Grand Theater, and they'll have the court there at his house. John Banton had an early tavern close to the Garrard house. You know where the arts meets? He had a tavern there somewhere. These are the ones that are mentioned there.
On
And,
Lexington Street, is that where you're talking about? That tavern on Lexington Street?
well, it's long gone, the John Banton Tavern. But the court met in his house one time before there was a Lancaster, and he had a tavern right there somewhere behind kind of the Garrard house, there on Lexington Street. You know where the arts people meet. Fits square to a lot, you know. Okay. I don't know if I ever finished this thought or not, because prior to Lancaster, it began as Dryden's Tavern. That's where Thomas Buford of this home got married, ran the tavern. Before he ran the Buford's Tavern up there at the Justice Center, the old Thompson and Mara for a while, before he moved here. Also, this would be roughly 1784. Dryden's Tavern would be what would become Lancaster. By 1798, a brother-in-law of Henry Powell named Andrew Wallace had a home, and they called the area right at the Baptist Church Wallace's Crossroads. This trace that I described earlier, coming up from Craig Station, that came up Campbell, South Campbell, Mill Street, Ball Alley, was crossed by a road going from Richmond to Danville, and that was called Wallace's Crossroads. Of course, like I say, he was a brother-in-law of Henry Powell. Had married a sister, Elizabeth Wallace, of Caleb Wallace, the first Supreme Court Justice of the Supreme Court in Kentucky over at Danville. It really gave him a good position to argue his case for Lancaster against Speed, because he's related to the Chief Justice of the Kentucky Supreme Court. And he had a brother living here, another brother-in-law, Andrew Wallace, living by the Baptist Church. I mention that because the old town prior to Lancaster, I mentioned all these people and told where they lived, say within a mile or two, but the little settlement would have run from Dryden's Tavern, which is probably directly, they use the water from Baker Spring, but I take it that it was that, that gravel lot behind the Christian church, between the Christian church and Campbell Street, there's a big flat gravel. Some of these deeds and order books, in some of these where they're talking about rerouting the roads, they call that the old ground. That means that's the original settlement, the old ground, where William where William Dryden had his tavern and where they did. See, they would, when we were a part of Lincoln County, they had to have elections, like they had to elect overseers of the poor and stuff like that. They would have the election at Dryden's Tavern. And the first order of the county business when Lancaster and Garrard County was created, they had to reroute all the roads. Because there was no Lancaster, basically, not in a central location, there wasn't a need for all the roads to connect here. So a very time-consuming part of the early court's business was making sure all the county roads led to Lancaster, just like all roads in Italy led to Rome, And anyway, that's where I came across that reference to calling that the old round. But I say, if you wanted to travel the old original town, start there. That gravel lot behind the Christian church, kind of amble down toward the old depot and walk down Campbell Street, because you probably can't go down there behind Bastions, but just look down there. And you're walking along the old settlement that predates Lancaster. Go down Mill Street, go down Ball Alley, and that was the old town. And
Are these taverns you're talking about, are they places where people went to drink, or where they stayed overnight, or what?
well, taverns kind of deceiving. I mean, they were the equivalent to a hotel today. They were not primarily a place to drink, but you could order a drink. I mean, in fact, the state set the rates. So much for a glass of beer, so much for a whiskey, so much for a steak. So much to keep your horse overnight. And but it was primarily people coming to court had to have a place to stay, had to have a place to keep their horse, had to have feed for them, and but Buford's Tavern became kind of so close it was to the courthouse. All the lawyers who have kind of a shy. I hope none of y'all are lawyers, but they like to gamble and drink. They all go down. There was a tavern down below ground, right as you went in that first door. And that's where they got all the lawyers would gamble and drink, between court cases and stuff.
See who's going to
Okay.
It's interesting, when I think of settlings of towns, I think of, because they have to have a mill, they have to have, groceries and water and salt and things like that. I don't think court.
Yeah.
I'm realizing that courthouses are very important.
Everybody
always suing everybody?
Lancaster was created to be the county seat of a new county. It didn't exist as a real set. It was just a crossroads with a tavern, a couple of taverns maybe, by the time they made Lancaster. And a few people lived there, but that was basically all it was a crossroads with a couple of taverns. But there were plenty of mills around, like the closest one to town, there's several on Boone's Creek. One of our grandfathers, Fethergill Adams, who was a Baptist preacher, had a mill down on Sugar Creek at the end of Jack Black Road. That was a very prominent mill, not too far away. But the first mill that I ever know in Lancaster was right there on the old ground. There was a Denny, George Denny. It made swan flour there in the late 1800s. Lancaster's on the crest of the Dividing Ridge. That's not a very good place for a mill seat when you're dependent on water power. We didn't have any creeks with enough flow to turn a mill. Of course, when George Denny put his in, it's going to be powered by some type of burning some type of fuel. I'd have to go back and read more about that. But, he was basically put out of business by what became Garrard Mill later.
But courthouses were that important.
Oh, yeah.
I've been in a courthouse maybe once in my life, so I understand. They're always
people loved to sue back in those days, and everything you did required, to trade land, sell land, you had to go to the courthouse to get it done.
Oh, okay.
And they had what they call court days when the court was in session, and that kind of replaced the old British. So many were basically people from the British Isles. A lot of their traditions were passed over, and the court days, everybody came to town to trade cattle and horses, and it was just almost a little festival, court day. Mount Sterling still celebrates court day.
Yeah, I just thought that was a fluke. I didn't realize that.
No, but every county had a court day, and it was a big deal. Everybody would come to town, put their horse in a boarding stable, or they'd ride it up and down the street and show them what a good lick it would hit. They rode saddle horses and stuff back then. and trying to get people to offer them money for it. It was the holiday. Okay. How are we on time, Aaron?
We've got 4 hours left.
Yeah, it's not even
Oh,
dark yet.
I got another paper here.
Tell us how Briantsville was considered.
Okay, I wrote that in one of the handouts. When they see they're going to have the new county of Garrard, well, where do we put the county seat? Many people argued for Smithtown, which is another of our grandfathers, it's James Smith. But anyway, of course, James was dead by then. He'd gone insane. When he got captured by the Indians, they tortured him and a lot of the people with him, and it totally blew his mind. But anyway, his son Edmund had the Burnt Tavern there, and they called that Smithtown. A lot of people argued that was the best place for the county seat, and it probably would have been. Think about it. You've got acres and acres, 800 acres of level land. You're on the main Hickman Road going north to Lexington. You can access all the other settled parts of Kentucky. But why did we choose this little hillside, this crest of a hillside, Lancaster? Because Speed and Paulding are on the Lincoln County Court, and they pull strings. I mean, I'm guessing, but I mean, that's probably what happened. And I don't think the best site got selected, but it is what this is where they selected the county seat to be. I really think, the deal was, if you could get it declared a county seat and get the surveyed off into lots, that would stop any lawsuits on that part. See, so there's one reason they might want to have it here. Plus, your land that you own all around it is going to be more valuable. And okay, we're up to. Well, let's just say we're settled. We have the town. How many courthouses were there? That's an interesting fact. I kind of dig through that. Does anybody have a
3?
Yeah.
3.
Okay. Eugenia Dunlap says in her song of Lancaster, the original courthouse was a house of logs that soon fell down. That's kind of what way she tells it. Okay. Prior to there ever even being a survey for Lancaster, of course, first they made at George Douglas's house, then they made at John Banton's Tavern, they made 2 or 3 different homes around. But then they began to meet in the courthouse in Lancaster before they'd even put out the specs for the courthouse, for the brick courthouse, So where was that? I would guess that she knew something. There was a log courthouse that they met in that year and a half before they could build the brick courthouse. Okay?
Well, I've read it's pretty much right up on the square where the original circle was.
Yeah.
And it was logs.
Okay,
And the
that's
part
right.
of being falling down or whatever.
Where did you get that information? I'd love to see it. I mean,
Some
all I've
of it
ever
come
found
out
is
of,
Eugene. Yeah, I know.
Forest Calico
Yeah.
and patches
Praise
of
be
Gary
Forrest
Ford.
Calico's name. He's so much better than I would be. But a
But
lot of stuff,
it
that's,
speaks of that woman
I
writing
know,
that.
but
and
you
all.
got to. I would like to find an original source because
Well, his is taken from the records that they had to have some kind of a courthouse to get it out of
I'm not
individuals'
arguing.
houses. But then, like you said,
we're agreeing.
they built a brick one.
Yeah,
that
I agree that there was probably a log courthouse in the square, but I never found any direct evidence for it. What you're citing is to me kind of secondhand, but
Well, I don't know that most of what he
I don't know
read
if
we
Lancaster
proved
was
correct.
like this, but going back to that time, like you said, a lot of the court proceedings were done in taverns.
yeah, right. Grayson's
Yeah,
Tavern
they-
over
they-
Danville.
You
with
can't
water.
sell no liquor today. We're having the judge, the circuit judge would show up. We're having court.
But you had to have an official.
But they
goes back
they
to
do
your
call it
question
the
on
courthouse though. That was the thing. If it had been a tavern, I think when they met at a home or a tavern, they call it that. But they began to say we're meeting at the courthouse prior to even putting the plans together for the brick courthouse. But anyway, you could be right. So much of this stuff, I've tried to go back and find first-hand information, either court records or depositions from the time, to make my case, and rather than rely on second-hand accounts, which you know, and I make mistakes. Don't take everything I say here tonight as being absolute right. It's taking firsthand information and trying to put two and two together and thinking that you see that it makes four. You know, because not everything gets spelled out. But I do think it's safest to rely on original documentation from the time, because there are things that have led people astray over the years. And like I say, I don't, anyway.
So are there just two documented courthouses?
Well, they made big plans for a courthouse in 1798 to be in the center of the square with a stone foundation. It gives the dimensions and everything, with 10-foot ceilings, 21 feet to the top of the arch. We never actually read. My mom has argued, she claims that she wondered if it was ever built. I think it was. I'll tell you why, because they actually award the contract, one to do the rock and stone work. Jesse Gooch is supposed to do all the woodwork. And then in that should have been done about 1800 anyway. In 1805, Ben Letcher, General Ben, he was getting old and creaky, and he complained about being cold. He was county clerk for 30 years, you know. He's the father of the governor, Letcher. They in the courts, they agreed to build a clerk's office addition to the courthouse, and it matches the construction of the 1798 planned courthouse. I can't believe, you know, with the rock construction, the brick walls, and 16 by 16, and with an 8-plate iron stove, so Ben Letcher can stay warm. And I don't believe they would have built that if they hadn't have built the brick courthouse there in the center of the square. But then by 1811, these old brick ones had dirt floors in the specs. And in 1811, somebody stands up in court, says he don't think the courthouse is any longer in keeping with the dignity and the wealth of the county. So they propose a much nicer courthouse. They propose that all the materials from the existing courthouse be sold to help fund the new courthouse. So we build that courthouse that lasts until through the Civil War. Then we build one. This time, they were always a little cramped there in the town square. There was thought to be plenty of room early, but you know, as the county got bigger and more stuff going, they take the warehouse lot of John 29 Scott, there where the courthouse is now, and build the courthouse we have now. It's in operation by, I think they're doing all the planning in 68. It's definitely in operation by 69. So I think there were 4 courthouses. I mean, but again, how do you prove that? You know, they never really can. They don't, in the order books and things, they're not writing a history. They're doing the county's business. And sometimes they don't write things that we wish they had to tell us exactly what happened. And so sometimes it's hard to say for sure and exactly what happened. We just do the best we can. But I'm sure what time is it? Anybody know? It's about time. I didn't even get into the second paper, but I hope y'all have enjoyed it. It is just such a big subject, and I tend to get lost in my thoughts as I present it, but you're welcome to look through this. And I did like the description of the county. Read that in your little handout. Garrard County, can you imagine what a wonderful place this was prior to settlement? And we kind of mixed it up a little bit almost, but anyway.
Did everybody get a copy of that one? I'm gonna lay them right here on the desk if anybody wants one to get another one.
Here's another set that I could hand out that's a little repetitive. If anybody's really interested, you're welcome to take one of these. If you're just wanting to read more, well, here's another one I could have handed out. This has just got more information. And anybody that wants one, they're right here. I got a few, and you're welcome to them. That was more or less notes. Did you say you'd like to have one? I didn't really get into this one, but I think we've done enough. I think your minds are blown.
Can you pass another one of those back?
Yeah. Some of this is a little bit repetitive, but I wrote this that I could look at during my talk, and I never did even open it up. So.
The people of the historical
Okay.
society.
Well, thank you all for listening. I hope I didn't bore you to death.
Thank you for your.
All right.